My name is Hugo Hinsley, and I'm one of the directors of the postgraduate school here in the Architectural Association. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for what I believe is the inaugural annual lecture of the Landscape Research Group. We're very honored to have David Lowenthal, who is well known, I'm sure, to all of you. David has lectured in the AA before over his long career, but never, I think, in this main lecture hall. So it's very nice to have David back again. I'm going to hand over now to Ian Thompson, the chairman of the board of the Landscape Research Group, to introduce the evening's proceedings. And then at the end of David's lecture, there'll be time for some questions. And then following that, we have some drinks, some canapes in a side room. So I'll hand over to Ian now.
This is a sort of relay, because I'm going to hand it over to somebody else in a moment. I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Landscape Research Group. For anyone who doesn't know about the Landscape Research Group, it's a charitable organisation which exists to promote research and understanding of landscape issues. And we're a very broad church. I am a philosophically minded landscape architect, and I'll be succeeded next year by a sociologically minded forester. And here we are in a school of architecture to listen to a lecture by an eminent geographer. So all of these things have a bearing upon landscape. I'd like to thank the AA for making this wonderful room available to us and for coming on board with this joint venture. And I'm now going to pass this on, because you'd rather hear David, I'm sure, than me, to Antonia Nucia, who incidentally is an architect with an interest in cultural geography, another of our board members who will introduce David to you.
Hi, I would like to start with a personal note, which is that I am among those who David helped him to find or change a direction in terms of career. I don't think that David Lowenthal needs introduction, so I'll be very, very short. He was one of the founding members of the Landscape Research Group, so we're very happy to have him starting the series of the annual lectures about issues of landscape. And in terms of landscape, he is the key figure for leading a path for new thinking about landscape as early as in 50s. He was the one who transformed the idea of landscape as a technical term to a phenomenon for epistemological inquiry. He was influenced by the work of George Marsh on landscape perception, and he developed this, the whole area of landscape perception. And also his main contribution was to show landscape as an area for cultural activity rather than landscape for itself. But I'm sure you all know very well his work, so there's no any point to introduce his research and books and his long career. But also, I would like to emphasize David Lowenthal as a teacher who always had an open door and open house policy to anyone who was interested in discussing their ideas with him. And there is a paper that Ken Allwood wrote in 2003 called The Landscape, the Lowenthal Legacy. And I would like to read out something from that. And says that Lowenthal has managed to appeal to a public that goes far beyond disciplinary bounds within and outside geography, and even beyond academia itself. A seminar with Lowenthal may attract not only archaeologists, anthropologists, and geographers, but also architects and planners, tribal representatives, and West Indian statesmen, as well as the odd farmer and fisherman, not to mention poets, novelists, and painters. Such seminars, in turn, tend to become the site of a form of anthropological research in which the participants become partners in the ongoing discourse that make up the staff of Lowenthal scholarship. And I think this is the audience today. And thank you.
Thank you. Can I be heard properly? Yeah. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Architectural Association, which used to have the best lunchroom in Bloomsbury, as well as quite a lot of interesting people on the faculty and among the students, and the best bookshop from which to steal books in the days when books still mattered as much as they did. It's also a great pleasure to be back with the LRG and to feel that really this ought not to be, it should be Jay Appleton here tonight, who is the true founder of the LRG and who remains a guiding figure, mentor for all of us in his 90s. But Jay couldn't make it down today from Hull. But I'm pleased that so many of the LRG people from the 70s and 80s are here tonight. I remember with such fondness dealing with Steve Shuttleworth and Peter Howard, Rafe Cobham, Marion Shord, Lindis Cole, Bud Young, and many others. Landscape architects, among their other wonderful traits, are very long-lived. They seem to emulate trees in their lifestyle, getting old gracefully and dying long after everybody expected them to. The connection that I want to make between Eden and Earth Day is something that essentially came into prominence a half a century ago, connection between religion and ecology, for a variety of reasons that I will be talking about. But I want first to stress what the themes of what I'm going to be talking about, to remember the particular aspects of landscape restoration that I feel have been influenced, especially by their religious origins. There are a number of assumptions which are difficult to carry out, difficult to demonstrate, but very, very important in terms of the influence that they exert over professionals and academics as well. One is that landscape is superior, that nature is superior to culture, that nature trumps culture in many ways. Another is that there are pristine, untouched landscapes. A third is that landscapes, nature generally, can repair itself and ought to repair itself. And fourth is that wilderness, untouched landscape, can be restored. Those four general points of view will be recurring constantly throughout the rest of what I have to say. But The idea of Eden as the origin and the Garden of Eden as the origin is the most significant aspect of the connection between Eden and Earth Day. Eden has to be seen in a variety of contexts, both as the origin of so many things human and as the beginning of the evolution of many things human, and as a paradigm for legacies that we have lost. The Garden of Eden no longer exists, and it is constantly remembered as a founding thing. I will show you simply Alessandro Scaffi's wonderful cover for his book on mapping of paradise, and allow a copy of that, together with a copy of a picture of the Garden of Eden from a Lutheran Bible of 1536 for each of the rows. The other prominent beginning that Eden reflects is it was the first drug bust. It was the first event in which people became besotted with some forbidden fruit and were forbidden ever after to touch it. But this depends, in fact, on the notion that it wasn't an apple, but a mushroom, a psychedelic mushroom at the base of the tree that Adam and Eve were involved with. And there's a whole cult in the counterculture about the way in which this forbidden fruit enables people to see better and to see further and to see more through its visionary qualities, but also to feel that it's hard to see unless one is one of the elect, and furthermore that of course it's forbidden, that one is not supposed to see it at all. Hence the war on drugs, which continues to this day. We are not allowed to have those kinds of visions. And the notion of Eden as the seat of forbidden knowledge is something that has been profoundly influential throughout history. On the maps, especially the medieval and early modern maps that Alessandro has written about, we see that Eden is both a place and not a place. It exists somewhere, but it's not supposed to exist anywhere that you can find. It exists far to the east of anywhere, which of course makes it up there, since medieval early modern maps face east up there. But it is beyond the possibility of being seen, and certainly beyond the possibility of being entered. One is not allowed to imagine that one can ever get into the Garden of Eden. It's not findable. So, in a way, to me, Eden is like the modern GPS. You think you're going somewhere with a GPS, and you end up in a cul-de-sac, usually. Certainly never anywhere that you want to be. Eden, of course, is also associated with something that audiences frequently suffer from, which is sleepiness in the midst of a long lecture, because the land of Nod was where Cain ended up, as you may recall, after the expulsion from the garden. So east of Eden, there's also west of Eden. There are a great many books and films dealing with what is both east and west of Eden. But Eden itself, with high walls around it or with dangerous rivers to cross, is never to be found. The flip side of this in medieval times was the garden, the the hortus conclusus, the walled garden, which contains always traditionally the Virgin Mary, a fountain, and a unicorn. All of this is derived from the Song of Songs. But this walled garden represents a combination of the ideas of the things that are important about Eden. Its purity, its virgin nature, and virgin nature of nature, together with the sense of being out of bounds. It's enclosed. It cannot be reached. The Virgin Mary, of course, is a representative of all of these things. In the Garden of Eden, practically nothing ever happens. In the walled garden, the medieval walled garden, you walk and you listen to music. That's about it. Not a bad life. Better than flying on clouds in heaven. These visions of Eden, which are, in spite of, or perhaps because of the fact that it's unfindable and out of bounds, these wonderful visions of Eden began to fade, at least cartographically fade, with the discoveries of various new worlds and the recognition of the impossibility on a global Earth of ever coming to terms with something that was both of the Earth and not of the Earth. So, as time has gone by, what do we find Eden associated with? Well, if you Google Eden, you will find that it's attached to garden centers, to laundries, to holiday spots, and especially, for some reason, to cruises. You'd think that a cruise representing Eden is impossible, since the whole point of cruises is that they're moving around somewhere else. But no, there are infinite numbers of cruises with Eden-esque characteristics. Then in this country, of course, we have the Eden Project in the far west, in Cornwall, which is supposed to represent a limitless possibility of joy and pleasure. And the flip side of this, in Diana Saville's marvelous novel, Capabilities Eden, which refers, of course, to Capability Brown, the great gardener. And Capability Brown himself is talked about in terms of the Edens that he created in many of the landscape gardens which he worked. Finally, the point about Eden to remember is that Eden represents the notion of redemption. In the end, this is where, associated with the God's mercy at the end of time, where all of the earth will be redeemed and restored back to its Eden-esque beauty. All right, what about Earth Day? Earth Day begins in 1970. It is the brainchild of a Wisconsin politician and ardent Lutheran named Gaylord Nelson, who was for 30 years a senator in Washington, and who spurred, among other things, John F. Kennedy's tour, a conservation-minded politician, just months before he was assassinated in 1963. Nelson got the idea of Earth Day from the anti-war demonstrations of the late 60s, especially the anti-Vietnam activists in the university. And the consequence of this was that Earth Day became, the 22nd of April, 1970, the largest organizational demonstration ever, grassroots, with 20 million people in the United States taking part in a mass movement to save the environment, to save nature. Now, what did this actually come out of? It came out of a concatenation of problems that people were beginning to find in the misuse of resources and environment. The risks of detergents, of pollution, of the use of DDT, and so on. The work of Rachel Carson, which had highlighted the poisonous effects of a great many things that were commonly used in fertilizer and elsewhere. An effort, therefore, to restore a proper relationship between humans and other species and the environment. And a rejection, especially in America, a rejection of the frontier philosophy that had been so predominant in the American mind for 3 centuries, that is, the land is there to use hard and to move on, that it was not something that needed ever to be saved, conserved, stewarded. It was just something put there by God for Americans to consume and to plunder. And the notion that the earth was not just here to be plundered, but to be saved, conserved, treated gently, and also treated in a way that made life worth living, both for humans and for other creatures. You remember this is also the time of the moon shot, the moon landings, the period when the exploration of the earth, as seen from the moon, became a kind of icon. It was the notion of island Earth, this fragile, small globe as seen from space, which took hold of the imagination of so many millions of people. It's amazing to reflect back 40 years and recall that this was so, but I do indeed remember this. The idea was, what's the point of going to the moon if all we do is see how we're wrecking the earth? The internal combustion engine was regarded as the evil demon of all. It was the principal problem, getting rid of the polluting powers of the automobile, and also the wreck of the landscape and the cityscape that people were beginning to recognize in car culture. And although the whole enterprise of Earth Day was secular in its origins, it was pursued with a kind of religious zeal. There was a sense of pursuing a sacred cause that was very, very much the touchstone of the early activists in Earth Day. There was certainly a feeling of tremendous urgency, almost an apocalyptic sense of we've got to do something now. And I remember the stories that used to circulate then. An earlier story about somebody at the planetarium who came up to the lecturer and said, "Did you say that the sun was going to go out in 3 million years?" And he said, "No, I said 3 billion years." "Oh," she said, "what a relief." Well, I remember in the early 70s, the ecologists were saying, if we don't do something in 35 years, we're all in terrible trouble. But it was misheard. 3 to 5 years, we're in desperate trouble. In the sense of the speeding up of the risks that people were letting themselves in for. was so prominent at the time. And this was the time not only of Rachel Carson, but the Club of Rome and all of the doom-laden prognoses of overpopulation as well. Besides that, in America, there were a number of particular events that influenced, that really kicked off the whole of the Earth Day business. One was an oil spill off the coast of California in Santa Barbara, which seemed to have the potential to destroy bird life over a very, very large area. Pictures of seabirds being coated with oil were spread around the country. A second was a river in Ohio, the Cuyahoga River, which ran from Cleveland into Lake Erie. This river ran through the most heavily polluted, industrialized segment of that part of the United States. It was never blue or clear, it was always brown, and occasionally it caught on fire because of the amount of stuff in it that was combustible. And there was a big fire in the Cuyahoga River just a few months before Earth Day. And all this stuff went into Lake Erie. Lake Erie at that time was a dead lake. No life could live in it. It's since then been, to some extent, restored. But if something fell into the river, it didn't die. It decayed. It didn't drown. It decayed. And this brown sludge went over. There's a well-known pop song of the time by Randy Newman that went, "Burn on, big river, burn on, big river. Now the Lord can make you tumble, and the Lord can make you turn. And the Lord can make you overflow, but the Lord can't make you burn." And this became a chant, an Earth Day chant for many of the young. As a popular protest, it equaled the protest of Vietnam, and it's perhaps similar in its somewhat ambiguous nature to the Occupy Wall Street protests of the present moment against the automobile being replaced as the evil genius by the bankers. At the same time, it was regarded in many circles as utopian, something that was simply totally unrealistic, because a great deal of the talk was about giving power to other creatures, not just human beings, but power to eagles, power to plankton, power to trees, power to all things. As time went on, it more and more took on a tone of religious exhortation, and pollution was seen and used. Pollution was the gateway to hell, and so one could imagine that ecology and ecological use of things was the gateway to paradise. And President Nixon, at the time, of all presidents, used a very, very powerful biblical analogy. He said, "I want the air clean, and it will be clean. I want the water to be clean, and it will be clean." Well, this was 2 years before Watergate, so, but nevertheless, he had to say these things, because at the same time of these kinds of exhortations, there were exhortations on the opposite side, the end time people, Hal Lindsey and others who wrote the Left Behind series and were predicting end time at any moment, and that it didn't matter what we did to the environment because we were all about to be consumed by by this Holocaust, by the apocalyptic ending of everything, the biblical forecast of a catastrophic upheaval that would rupture all of nature. Anyway, what the effect of Earth Day was actually profound. It was an amazing success. On account of Earth Day, the Environmental Protection Association Agency was founded, the one that's now under threat from Republican candidates for the presidency in Washington. The Clean Water Acts, the Clean Air Acts, the protection of various wild species, the elk, the timber wolf, and so on. And the whole notion of the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the earth became significant in American and also world affairs. There were those who doubted this. There was an antagonism on the part of some, but not all, industry, and also an antagonism on the extreme right, who saw Earth Day as an undercover attempt to bring communism to the United States and the world. After all, Earth Day was anti-Christian. It was a pagan holiday. And don't forget, Earth Day is also Lenin's birthday. So the anti-Christian tenor of Earth Day, as it was we shouldn't do anything about the ecological crisis because God has ordained it. We should just let it happen. That God and Jesus are going to bring total disaster to the environment, and it must happen. Of course, human sin is ultimately responsible for all of this, but it would and it should happen, and don't try to stop it. Now, the origin of the thinking behind a lot of Earth Day and behind the connection between Eden and Earth Day comes from a seminal talk by the historian Lynn White, Jr. in 1967 called The Ecological Crisis of Our the Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, which was published in Science magazine, talked about the ruinous character of what was happening ecologically and blamed it largely on Western monotheism, especially Christianity. The feeling that in Western monotheism there was an antagonism to the natural world, that Christianity, Judaism, Islam together forgot the old pagan worship of nature itself, the trees, the sacred groves, the sacred fountains, all of the things that early people had revered were not only forgotten, but they were denounced as anti-religious, anti-Christian, or whatever, pagan. That this arrogant Orthodox Christianity in particular saw man as the only creature made in God's image, and the point of creating man was to control all the rest of creation, to dominate all rest of creation. The most anthropocentric religion ever invented. Also, Christianity held out no hope, as I've just suggested. You're supposed to let everything go to hell or be destroyed because this is what is predicted, what the Bible has predicted. In Adam's fall, we were cursed, all. That's the point of Adam's fall, to leave humanity as totally cursed. Well, Lynn White said this is all wrong. What we need is not more science, we've got the science that tells us this is bad. We need better religion. Christianity itself especially needs to be reformed. And he put out as the prime mentor St. Francis, the idea that one really needed to look at the rest of nature as co-equal in the eyes of God, and the whole relationship of humans to the natural world should be taken from St. Francis, who made the birds sing, who made the wolves in the Apennines behave themselves, who essentially allowed all other creatures their proper role in the governance of the world. In other words, instead of being conquerors of nature, humans should be stewards along with the rest of nature. The Franciscan view of Christianity became a very powerful spur, not only to Earth Day, but to the whole movement that made a collaborative venture of a great deal, not only of Roman Catholicism, but all of the other creeds, including Buddhism and other non-monotheistic religions during the 70s and 80s, and really up until this day as well. Overboard for many people, especially if you read the works of St. Francis and his notions of what mattered to the birds and the bees and the flowers, and his canticle in praise of the earth, Mother Earth, brother star, sister moon, all of that sort of thing. This is known in some quarters as birdbath Franciscanism, where the main point about this reform is what you do in the garden with statuary and flowers. Well, so the main point of White's attack on Christianity was that God created, and human beings, instead of simply taking over as overlords, human beings are the restorers, should become the restorers of nature. This became the tone of restoration ecology. Restoration was seen as something that not only repaired the losses that occurred as a result of Adam's fall, but it improved on nature. It made nature better than it had been originally. And it led to a notion that improving nature, restoring nature, would also at the same time restore human integrity and spiritual health. That we should, in fact, copy Christ, who had restored humans from their ugliness into the beauty of his image. Indeed, the works of restoration were seen as worthier than the works of creation by a famous visionary 12th century theologian, Hugh of St. Victor, who said, after all, restoration heals and reveals and illuminates and demonstrates, and restoring things that have been laid waste or fallen into ruin perfects them. So you're changing the water of creation into the wine of restoration. A wonderful image for those of us who prefer wine to water. This proactive image of restoration lasted through the Renaissance and early modern times. Erasmus, for example, the great theologian of the 16th century, the restorer of the New Testament to its original meaning and truth. He saw restoration both of the Bible and of nature as in accordance with God's original intent. And he praised the current Pope, Leo X, as a second Esdras, biblical figure, that the Pope was restoring Rome just as the Old Testament prophet Esdras had restored Jerusalem. And he told the Pope, no, you're doing better. You're restoring great things. That's harder. But it's a nobler task even than to have created them in the first place. It's in line with the Renaissance view of humans as extraordinary, as creators. So it goes, the notion of restoration, improving on things, becomes the image of what is called the fortunate fall. That is to say, Adam's fall from grace in Eden led to better things in the end than had been present in the original Eden in the first place. But how do they do this? How do they manage to achieve a sense that Eden could be improved upon? Well, if you read the Bible as Milton did, you recognize that Adam and Eve are not being told to control, to conquer, or just live in paradise. No, they have to work hard. They have to till it. They have to do all the work that a gardener has to do, or it becomes wild and ungovernable, just as human beings become wild and ungovernable if you don't treat them, tend them properly. So in Milton, in all of the work, Areopagitica and in Paradise Lost, you have this image of the fortunate fall as the consequence of Adam and Eve working terribly hard, actually too hard. It was one of the things that drove Eve nuts. She couldn't cope with all of the work in paradise that had to be done. So here they are, and then they're of course told by the angel that the result of all of this, yes, it's terrible and they're exiled, but the final result will be that because history now begins, and it's possible for other human beings to take over, that the result of human work, human restoration, will leave the world in a better state than it ever could have been had Adam not sinned in the first place. And that Eden would be left down to posterity, better cultivated than it had been at the start. This view of things was reiterated pretty well down through the late 19th century. I think the last image of it that I have is from the Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, B.F. Westcott, who looked at the revelation of St. John and said, oh, the revelation says God is going to restore with men's help, going to restore man and restore nature side by side. The vision of active help in creation, in the restoration of Eden, fell afoul of the Enlightenment and romantic cults of originality, according to which humans were not supposed to be doing any of these things, and were certainly not doing, progress was not following God's command in that particular way. And that restoration, as everybody began to recognize, was impossible because time's arrow moved on in such a way that nothing could ever be brought back to what it had been before. And this is particularly true in the realm of the arts, landscape painting, landscape painters, music, the whole realm of poetry, in which one was supposed to only do new things, not restore old things. Restoration was just a necessary evil sometimes. Now, nature and landscape begin to come into conceptions of restoration, along with the rediscovery of nature in the early Renaissance by Petrarch and others, in which it becomes possible to think again about nature not just as disgusting or horrid or something to avoid or something to fight against, but as sacred and sublime. So we have to give this to the Romantics as well. But it was also associated with the notion of purity from the very beginning of the rehabilitation of nature in the Western mind. And the first notions of nature that became significant were not wild nature, but pastoral nature. The notion of nature that was tended, that in the especially 19th century England, to some extent France, the sense of fighting against industrial blight and urban squalor was going back, but not going back to a wild, untrammeled wilderness, but to an agricultural or park-like or garden-esque, anyway, intensely managed nature that was partly realized from the bucolic ideals of painters like Claude and Poussin, and of poets like Oliver Goldsmith and Wordsworth. It was nature that was controlled, perfected, managed. The notion of Adam being capability brown, as I suggested earlier. The notion of wilderness was not originally what people came to think of wilderness as being later on, untouched, pristine nature. Not at all. Everybody must remember, at least to some extent, was wilderness paradise enow in the poem? Well, what was wilderness in Fitzgerald's poem? Here, with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a book, a verse, and thou. Well, this is no wild landscape. This is an intensely managed and beautifully bucolic sense. Beside me singing in the wilderness, and wilderness is paradise enow. This is a Claudian or a bucolic wilderness, and it has been repeated and mocked in Western literature ever since. There's Wendy Cope's wonderful poem about London. Here, with a bag of chips beneath the bough, a can of beer, a radio, and thou. Beside me, half asleep, in Brockwell Park. And Brockwell Park is paradise enow. Brockwell Park is in Lambeth, Brixton, not too far from here, which became a paradise in 1981 when it was given to the community, and now has actually a walled garden full of earthly delights. And if you win a prize there, you get tickets to the Unicorn Theater, not too far away in Southwark, near where you had your meeting, in fact. The unicorn, of course, is the emblem of Scotland in the coat of arms. but Scotland under the control of the Lion of England. The original notion of nature restored, then, is not wilderness as conceived. The original notion was that of Thomas Burnet's in his theory of the sacred earth, in which the earth was going to return to its original smooth and elegant state, without any mountains, without all those awful valleys, without all those terrible wounds in the smooth body of the earth. It should be completely round and presumably easy to get around. But the vision of the restoration was the restoration to a totally controlled nature, without a wrinkle or scar or fracture in all of its body. In America, the idea of wilderness took hold partly as a reaction against, especially the English travelers and writers who visited America and criticized its landscape because it was devoid of culture and history. And Americans, although they also felt that it was devoid of culture and history, were not able to stomach the consequent criticism of America as wild, empty, full of nothing. There's the Gertrude Stein thing in America. There's no there. There's nothing in America that anybody could possibly be interested in because it was wild. So Americans took this and reversed it and said, sure, it's wild, untouched, nearer to God. This is the landscape as God made it in the first place. Far better than any of these cultivated and historical landscapes in the old world, which are full of the consequences of crime and pollution. The American landscape is pure because it is uncorrupted and original. And therefore, long before any of the actual moves to try to preserve wild landscape, the notion that the American landscape was better because it was wild, in this sense, took hold in the first half of the 19th century. The notion that wilderness, in order to be good, had to be untrammeled, became the guiding motif of the reformers of the late 19th century, who were beginning to see that the consequence of exploitation of nature in America was leading not only to the using up of resources, but to the wreck of the landscapes in which people lived and worked. And they exalted, therefore, the wild and untouched landscape. A fantastically interesting element of this is what happened to a lot of English adoration of cultivated landscape was simply transformed into wild landscape in the American sense. There's Dorothy Gurney's poem that one is nearer God's heart in a garden. One is nearer God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth. Well, they took this poem and changed the garden into a forest. In the American editions of the book, one is nearer to God's heart in the forest, not in a garden. So the whole thing becomes transformed. And the transformation is validated by the scholars and the historians. Frederick Jackson Turner, the great historian of the American frontier, talked about this, that this is what we do the American religion has to be this idea of the frescoes that are painted on the sky and the mountain wall, the cathedral spires of the great valleys and canyons of the American West. And the tokens that used to be of progress, the logger's axe and that sort of thing, the stump of the tree, which reflected progress, these became now tokens of horror. That was the rape of nature that they represented. When Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who actually created Central Park in New York, planted trees and organized trees in the park so that they would look natural. 20 years later, he started to prune them, and there was an outcry. He wasn't supposed to touch these things because they were natural. He'd succeeded far too well. He'd actually created, he'd managed nature to look as though it was untouched. This became, of course, the mantra of the whole national park system, in which practically every park was taken back to what it would have looked like if people hadn't been there in the first place. But the idea that nature, if it wasn't original, had to look original anyway, became the prime motive. The problem was that it was very expensive to do this. It takes a lot of money to make nature look as though nobody had ever touched it. And so, in fact, sometimes people go overboard and say, we have actually touched it. We've made it better than it was, and you should applaud us for this. If you look at wildlife films on television, no wildlife film is actually showing you nature in the raw. The lions in these films are taken out of farmed enclosures just at the right moment to pursue their prey. And the carcasses on the ground have been filled with jelly beans so that they will smell good to be consumed immediately. You can't just sit around waiting for nature to behave itself. It takes far too long. Similarly, the best acts of nature are to be found not in the zoo, where the hippopotamus and the crocodile are either asleep or avoiding people. No, you go to Disneyland where you see the facsimiles of these things operating. Well, the connection between this and biblical redemption becomes very clear in a bestseller of the time, early 20th century, The Trail of the Lonesome Pine, in which the area in question has been felled by soulless loggers, and the crystal clear stream is now black with soot and choked with sawdust. And the cruel, deadly work of civilization has ruined this piece of nature. And the hero of the novel vows that he's going to restore a Lonesome Cove. He's going to tear down those mining shacks and stock the river with bass and plant young poplars and cover every bit of torn up earth and bury every bottle and tin can and take away every sign of civilization from Lonesome Cove and leave old Mother Nature to cover up the scars, as his fiancée says, so that Lonesome Cove will be just as it was in the beginning, he says, and shall be to the end. This is restoration, redeeming everything in biblical terms. And it's vanquishing corporate greed, and it's excising the machine age poisons, and it's leaving Edenic plenitude in everlasting tranquility. And actually, the Earth Day campaign does result in the The Wilderness Act had been enacted in 1964, but it began to get teeth in the 70s. There are certain problems with this notion of wilderness. One was, of course, that it didn't exist anymore and needed to be recreated where it had been. The other was that it was seen to be coexistent with purity. In a wilderness, you couldn't have people in a wilderness. Consequence was that all of the first national parks had to get rid not only of the settlers, but especially they had to get rid of the Indians. And John Muir, who is the great apostle of this notion of wild scenery being godlike, especially fought against the Mono Indians in Yosemite, whose dirty and irregular life, as he put it, was polluting the purity of the mountains. But whereas in the wilderness, nothing is unclean. Everything is unspoiled. What's my timing? 5 minutes. I'm going to have to skip over the connections that I wanted to draw between landscape restoration and other kinds of restoration, the restoration of paintings and sculpture, the restoration of governments and political agencies, the restoration of human beings by medicine and health and so on. Because all of these metaphors began to creep into landscape restoration and to influence the founders of the landscape restoration movement with ideas about how you should do it and what you should say. But it actually resulted in a very difficult problem for landscape restoration, in that the consequences of taking on board this ecstatic vision of the restoration of landscape in accordance with everything that religion saw, that eco-theology was beginning to see as good, became harder and harder to realize. But I do want to say that among religious leaders who took on board the criticisms that I mentioned by Lynn White and then by many others, they began changing their tune. They began rereading the Old Testament and saying, oh, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like what we said before. The Old Testament is full of stewardship. It's full of the idea that that we follow the wisdom of the Sabbath, of Jubilee years, the restitution of land to others, and that the New Testament prophets really were trying to restore nature, not destroy nature. But the rereading of biblical texts has become a profound influence for the eco-theology people. And the number of texts in which we're told that our acts of restoration are similar to what God does in restoring us. That God is not the God that we used to think of at Calvary, but a process theology God who believes in working with people to continually improve nature. So what I'm suggesting is that there was a merging of these two groups of promoters for reform, the theologians and the landscape restorers. The problem being that they differed in many ways, and the differences have become more and more apparent. The differences are essentially these, that the theologians, the religious restorers, they don't believe in the idolatry of wilderness. That's wilderness without people, that's ridiculous. Instead, they insist we must have human interference in order to make nature better. And secondly, that we must care about human beings so that theological restoration involves involves a mission for ecological justice. And the sense you don't restore landscapes in order to make the landscape better. You restore a landscape in order to make people better, or the two things are actually connected. The landscape research group itself suffered from the confusion of these two images. During the time that I was a chair of the group, we had been given, thanks to J. Appleton, an enormous sum of money by Prentice Bloedel. Prentice Bloedel was a great forest magnate on the west coast of the United States and Canada, who in old age began to regret the rape of nature that he had caused up and down the coast, and wished to do something about it and make amends, and found in J. Appleton and the Landscape Research Group a wonderful vehicle for doing this, because we were so pure. It was clear that we were not interested in money, that our hearts were in the right place. We were scholars, some of us at least, and that Jay was a person who could be relied on to be honest. Not only that, he got better tax breaks in Britain than he would have got in North America. So he gave us all this money. Why? To find ways that people could make trees and nature generally help people with their health problems. That is to say, make nature healthy so that healthy nature could make people healthy. And we were asked to set up a program where people would apply for grants of different ways of helping people, to help them help nature, help the rest of us. And as time went on, we were vetting tens and then hundreds and then thousands of petitions from people, and it was very successful, but it took all our time. And by the end of the first 3 years, we were so overwhelmed by this that when I went to renew the contract, I went to Seattle to talk to them about it. We said, no, we can't do this anymore, or we have to have a staff of people to help us. I was trying to tell them that we had to slope off and do something a little less agonizing. But I never got to first base because it turned out that they were no longer interested in us anyway, because Prentice Bloedel had changed his mind. He was now in his late 80s, and he wanted something closer to home that he could actually see. So, in fact, they cut us off without a penny. And the result was that we flourished because we'd learned some organizational techniques as a result of having had the money. We were better off without the money than we ever had been with it. And as for Bloedel, what did he do? Well, he founded the Bloedel Reserve on Bainbridge Island in the state of Washington, which is a wonderful, beautiful place. Edenic, as they say. It's full of Edenic qualities and talked about. So he has his own private Garden of Eden as a consequence of this connection or disconnection from us. Well, The ecologists have learned some things from the theologians, too. The ecologists have learned from the theologians that you have to take people into account. If you don't take people into account, nobody is going to fund you anyway to do the things that you want to do. That faith in nature is not enough. You have to work within the system. And that this working within the system means an understanding of concern for the human voice. That the mission involves a recognition that landscape restoration is at one time ecosystem reform, the whole world, let's say, and at another time the protection of a species or even of an individual creature. In the second place, that all our efforts to restore things are incomplete and necessarily incomplete and fallible. We do have to wait for God at the end of time to restore everything, if God will consent to do it. And thirdly, that we can restore some things, but not all things. That especially the effort to restore wilderness is impossible. That there is no such thing as erasing all of the imprints of human beings. That nowhere on earth is devoid of the imprint of human civilization, human action, over not only hundreds of thousands, but millions of years. And that the notion of restoration is a wonderful ideal that can never actually ever be realized. That, in fact, going back to the wilderness is in some sense like faking art. It's something that we do necessarily because we like the notion of wilderness, but it's not achievable in reality. And perhaps, most of all, it's given us a different sense of what the wilderness, the benefits of wilderness and nature might be. "50 years ago, I participated in a program set up by Resources for the Future to define wilderness. We were asked to set up standards so that you could go into the wild and say, this is wild, this isn't. And after a mighty effort in Montana, we came to the conclusion that this was not possible because too many people had different ideas about what wilderness meant. And for instance, if you went into a so-called wild area, there are some people who said, oh, just walking there makes it no longer wild. And there are other people who said, well, you can have tents there, but they have to be made out of the right materials, natural materials. And but you mustn't have a radio, or you mustn't carry electronic equipment. The whole notion of how far you could intrude before wilderness was no longer wilderness became unmanageable. Became a matter of different views in different places over different periods of time. And I remember a colleague of mine, John Elder, who teaches ecology and English at Middlebury College in Vermont, a Californian who grew up in West Coast wilderness and was so bored by it because it wasn't the right kind of wilderness. He found the right kind of wilderness not in the untrammeled parts of the Sierra in the West, but in the Green Mountains of Vermont, where the wilderness includes the old refrigerator and the half-buried efforts of human beings. This is true wilderness because it includes all of the products of culture as well as the products of nature. And the idea of separating culture and nature becomes a nonsense. Culture and nature is one thing. Operates in different ways, perhaps, at different speeds and so on. But culture and nature are essentially one set of processes. And perhaps the final lesson is not to think about wilderness in the way that Aldo Leopold, the great ecologist, thought about it. Leopold said, you should never revisit a wilderness because the more golden the lily, the more certain it is that someone has gilded it. And to return to a wilderness not only spoils a trip, but it ruins a memory. So going to a wilderness in the first place is problematic. Going back to a wilderness becomes impossible. By contrast, think about J. Appleton, a poem in his most recent book, A Love Affair with Landscape. He's talking in this poem of St. Mary's Churchyard, where the rule of nature, as he puts it, the rule of nature still prevails, so the magic of this garden doesn't fail. And it's a recipe for happiness when culture mingles with the wilderness. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for David? Well, I'll start with one actually. It's not so much a question, an observation. There was a book about 10 or 15 years ago by a philosopher called Robert Eliot, I believe, called Faking Nature, and he argued that it was impossible to restore wildernesses because of the provenance wouldn't be right. You know, if you take a wild place, he believed that wilderness was the thing that was important, or naturalness was the thing that was important. And if people like landscape architects came along and tried to restore nature on a site that had been disturbed, no matter how well they tried to do it, they wouldn't be able to do it because there'd be an interval in which it had been something else. So logically it was an impossibility. And the faking nature was a sort of analogy with the art world. You know, this was like faking paintings. You know, you're faking nature. It was like the equivalent of faking a painting. And I just wonder what David would say to that argument. It's not my argument, by the way. I don't believe it's true.
It's very important to a lot of ecologists who called the problem that they had about restoration, they called it the Sistine Chapel problem, because it was like the problem of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. What do you do to restore something that, in order to restore it properly, you have to essentially ruin the context? It's like flooding. An agency had proposed to flood the Grand Canyon so that tourists could get closer to it. And it was like flooding the Sistine Chapel so that people could get closer to the ceiling. And the use of these analogies became hugely important among ecologists. And in a way, it's interesting to see that the art restorers have moved on, I think, faster than the ecologists, because art restoration now doesn't involve necessarily original intent or what it was in the first place, or let us go back to the original materials. Conservationists now say, oh, what a work of art is what it has become through the eyes of viewers and restorers as well as creators. And perhaps we could take a lesson from that.
Any questions from our audience? Yes, Gareth.
Well, I've just got a comment really. Your reference to Earth Day and the link with the communist, movement made me think that perhaps Eden was the first failed communist state, because people went around with to wear. they could only eat apples, and they were told they lived in paradise.
If it was the current communist state, but it had no preceding capitalist state, did it? It's de novo. You start with communism. So, yes, and I have to say that among archaeologists and some other prehistorians, there is a delightful sense that hunter-gatherer societies were egalitarian and essentially communistic in that sense.
This idea of restoration as doing something more than returning to the original theory made me think of the biblical vision of the new heaven, new earth, where the apocalypse is yes, still, yes, a destruction, but it's also a revelation of a new order. Could you see any insights in the eco-theology and, as you said, this difficulty of coming back? Because the Christian idea is that the new heaven and the new earth are different from you. It's something new.
This is very problematic, and I keep struggling with trying to understand it. But as I understood restoration in the Old Testament, and to some extent in the New Testament, what is being restored in the first instance is not nature. What's restored, the most important things to restore are the temple and the teachings of God, of Jesus. And whether the new firmament that comes at the end is simply new or building on the old is highly questionable. I can't answer that question. It's a real problem, especially since some people see destruction ahead of time as a necessary forerunner of the new. Very problematic. What do you think?
You're right. If you find the best answer, I would be intrigued to follow up and to see ideas in the past about the new earth from a landscape viewpoint. You mentioned this, the fact that the mountains will be level.
Yeah.
So will be, and you actually the print of Luther that circulated is interesting because it's a vision of nature that is no longer here but is a reference.
It's something that we have to work with.
I think maybe take one more question. I've been told that there are drinks waiting at the back of the room. Yes, please.
Just would like to concur with you in terms of there is no restoration of nature for nature's sake. There's always the human element, or the dimension of the human element. I come to this from the French tradition of the new museology, or liability museology, which try to reconcile anthropic and eco needs. The problem I have is it's a catch-22, that we need nature to nurture our culture. But if we go too far, we destroy that nature and consequently we affect our culture. Furthermore, even the term ecology, the word eco comes from Greek for oikos, meaning home. So it means that nature serves us gives us a sense of landscape, gives us a sense of place, gives us a sense of belonging. This part of our identity. It's more evident and clear in Africa, for instance, in Niger, Mali, and sub-Saharan countries, whose heritage has been taken to the West. So they return to landscape as part of nation building, as a part of their identity and cultural distinctiveness.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, but it's certainly not something that I could answer, except that the notion of nature and culture being at odds with one another is part of the inheritance of the dualistic philosophy that has been so difficult to overcome, because once you begin with a dualism, nature-culture dualism, you're forced to see them somehow as distinctly different and usually in opposition to one another, rather than with the possibility of combination and recognition of their joint beginning, their joint careers, their joint intention even, although it's hard for ecologists and other people to ascribe intent to anything except human beings. But remember, Catch-22 itself was originally not Catch-22. The author discovered that Catch-18, which he had wanted to use in the first place, was already taken by somebody else. And consequently, Catch-22 is is a revision of an original thing. And everything that we do in nature and culture is a revision of something that existed before, not a new creation, de novo. That is why Alessandro's question is so troubling, because nothing is de novo ever. It's imitation back and back and back all the way.
Well, I would like to thank David for a hugely erudite and very stimulating talk tonight. It certainly set my mind racing, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to follow up in conversation later. Could we show our appreciation, please? And I might say that in part, thanks to the generosity of the AA, we have some refreshments at the back of the room. And members of the board of the LRG, several of us, we had a board meeting today, so we're all here. And we're very willing to talk to members that we haven't met yet, and to people who are not members of the LRG but may think about joining. Thank you.